It's early evening, 1988. An East German express train loaded with 450 passengers thunders along the tracks at over 110 kilometres per hour. This stretch of rail, known as the Kanonenbahn, or Cannon Railway, connects Berlin to Halle through a section of a huge Soviet garrison and tank training complex known as Forst Zinna. The route is popular given its proximity and importance for East Germans commuting between Stralsund and Leipzig. Unbeknownst to the drivers, ahead is 36 tonnes of metal bumbling towards the railway and certain catastrophe. This video will explore what happened that night at Forst Zinna and the tragedy that unfolded in what was one of the worst rail disasters of the Cold War. Just southwest of the modest town of Locomotive in the state of Brandenburg lies the remnants of a sprawling military training area spanning over 11,000 hectares. Forst, or Forst Zinna in English, was originally conceptualised by the Nazis in 1934 as part of the wider Jüterbog training area. Home to elite Wehrmacht panzer and artillery units, Adolf Hitler Lager III, as it was known then, featured neat rows of solid brick barracks buildings, storage and maintenance facilities, ammunition depots, a hospital and even a swimming pool. A spur off the main rail line and train station were constructed nearby to ferry men and materials efficiently into the base. At the end of World War II, East Germany fell under Soviet occupation. Whilst the German Democratic Republic, or the DDR, was formed in 1949, the Soviets remained in direct command of key military installations, including Adolf Hitler Lager III, which was operated exclusively by the Group of Soviet Forces in Germany, or the GSVG in Russian. The base was simply renamed to Forst Zinna and was expanded with new accommodations, garages, and facilities to support the soldiers who served and their families. The 18th Guards Tank Army made primary use of the base, conducting live firing tank and artillery, nuclear war games, and other Warsaw Pact exercises. Here is an aerial view of Forst Zinna and the surrounding area as it looks today. The central complex can be clearly seen highlighted here and is approximately 1.3 to 1.5 kilometres squared. To the west is the Berlin-Halle rail line. However, the modern B101 highway running alongside the tracks wasn't constructed until around 2010 to 2015. Today, the base is abandoned, the buildings crumbling into ruin or demolished in the post-reunification years, and nature has reclaimed most of the surrounding area in just a few short decades. But let's pretend it's the 1980s. Accurate maps of the complex are not readily available. However, in my research, I was lucky enough to stumble across some Russian web forums and was able to get some great resources and accounts from individuals who actually served at Forst Zinna. The following layout approximation is what I was able to piece together with the photos from the 1960s through to the 1980s, as well as more modern images from urban explorers. If you are looking for an in-person perspective, I suggest you check out Andy McClune's excellent video on the same topic here. In this southwest portion, the 1930s era multi-storey brick barracks buildings are arranged in neat rows. Other structures included administration, schools, canteens, and an officers' club, even a playground. This base wasn't just part of the war machine. It was a home to many thousands of men and women, including their children. There was indoor and outdoor theatres. Ensembles and bands would play music and put on shows. Comrades would come together to eat and enjoy each other's company. It's clear to me from my research that many ex-Soviets still have many fond memories of their time at Forst Zinna. Over in this area are more modern 1970s style apartment buildings built during the Soviet expansion. Just nearby, possibly here, is an outdoor athletics and strength training area, and this building was likely a prison. I believe this larger open square was used for parade marches, ceremonies, and other official events. To the northeast was an outdoor football field, and the swimming pool was located here. The large open area to the north comprised the primary tank maintenance and testing facility. Warehouses, workshops and hangars are located here. Tank maintenance and refuelling would have taken place in this area. This large pool was for tank submersion testing. Along here was a hot water boiler and heating plant for the base and associated chimney still standing today. Centralised heating was a key part of Soviet civil engineering and were commonplace in cities, towns and military bases. To wrap up this area of the base, here is where the Forst Zinna station was located. We can approximate based on this track diagram that this section was a significant station with multiple sidings, unloading ramps, 2 platforms for passengers and an additional spur running southeast towards more garrison facilities down here. Extending wide to the east and west was where live fire and military exercises were conducted. Clearly shown in this image from the 1980s, you can see just how disturbed the ground is. Crucially, the railway bisects the 2 areas in the middle with no physical barriers in between the rail corridor and the flanking training areas. Tanks were expected to cross the railway without any permanent semaphore signalling to approaching rail traffic. Important to this story is that Forst Zinna was used as the primary training ground for new conscripts learning to operate Soviet armour such as the T-64 main battle tank for the first time. Military service was mandatory in the Soviet Union, and each year thousands of young conscripts were deployed to bases across East Germany, including Forst Zinna. Many just 18 or 19 years old, never having seen a tank up close, let alone driven one. Conscripts would arrive by road or rail to the base in waves, with those suitable assigned directly to an armoured unit for crew or mechanical roles. In 1988, the T-64, dating from the late 1960s, was still at the forefront of Soviet doctrine in Eastern Europe. Whilst the cheaper and mass-produced T-72 came after as an exportable and more robust version equipping East German divisions, the T-64 remained a more sophisticated machine with better armour and fire control systems. It was for the exclusive use by first echelon Soviet forces in the GSVG. Forst Zinna's 118th Tank Training Regiment was one such Soviet unit that made use of T-64s. First rolling off the production line in 1967, the T-64A was among the most advanced tanks of the period. It was the first Soviet design to feature integrated composite armour and a powerful 125mm smoothbore gun, capable of firing armour-piercing, fin-stabilised discarding sabot, high-explosive anti-tank and high-explosive fragmentation shells. A rotating carousel loading system replaced a traditional crew loader, which would automatically select, hoist and ram ammunition into the gun each firing cycle, improving fire rate with the trade-off of added complexity. Secondary armament comprised both a coaxial mounted 7.62mm PKT machine gun and a 12.7mm NSVT anti-aircraft heavy machine gun that could be controlled remotely from the commander's position. The heart of this beast was a 700 horsepower, 5-cylinder diesel engine coupled with a complicated semi-automatic gearbox. The tank was fast. It could do 60 kilometers per hour, but was notoriously difficult to maintain. Notice that the vehicle has a very low profile. Compare that to Western contemporaries such as the British Chieftain or American M60. This silhouette afforded better concealment, but meant extremely limited crew comforts and poor visibility, especially for the driver who had an outside view through a small periscope system here. For night operations, the tank was fitted with a TVN-2B passive night vision periscope for the driver. If it was really dark, the L-2 lunar infrared spotlight mounted adjacent the gun would need to be used in conjunction with the night vision optics to illuminate ahead of the vehicle. The Commander also had a night vision optic, a TKN-3 periscope, but it was more limited on account of being higher magnification for target acquisition. It was not suited for navigation. Both optics used early generation intensifier tubes, which were prone to poor field of view, graininess, and optical warping. More on this later. Finally, torsion bar suspension and 6 road wheels provided good cross-country performance. However, the low ground clearance meant the vehicle was prone to getting stuck on significantly uneven terrain, such as rail embankments. The express train coming up the tracks that night was a familiar sight across the East German rail network. The D716 route running between Leipzig and Stralsund was an important lifeline for the DDR. At the head was an absolute workhorse of East Germany, the Deutsche Reichsbahn Class E11 electric locomotive. The unit that day was numbered 006. Rugged and reliable, it was developed in the early 1960s by L.E.W. Henningsdorf and produced right up until the mid-70s. It also went through a reclassification from DR E11 to DR 211 and changed colour from the classic dark green with red bogies to the contemporary red and grey as shown here. It has 2900 kilowatts, weighed 82 tonnes and had a top speed of 120 kilometres per hour. Power to the 4 axles was via a 15 kilovolt overhead wire and pantograph mounted to the roof of the locomotive. In tow were 13 standard East German style passenger carriages, including dining car, similar to the model shown here. Nothing special, with simple seating and amenities for most. On board were 450 people, 50% less than the maximum capacity for that configuration, a fact that would prove fortuitous in the coming events. On the evening of the 19th of January, at approximately 17:45, a 19-year-old mechanic and conscript from Uzbekistan was undergoing his first night driving lesson on the T64. The exercise was under blackout conditions, with night vision equipment. Direct supervision was provided by a 20-year-old Russian instructor. Given it was January, it was already dark, and the two men would have been communicating via the tank's radio intercom over the engine noise. To assist the novice with the tank, the instructor had set the idle speed of the engine at 2000 RPM, in excess of the standard 1200 to 1300. This would reduce the likelihood of stalling. However, on even terrain, the T64 could move forward on its own in this configuration without any throttle input. From the yard at Forst Zinna, the instructor likely intended to guide the trainee out along this access road towards a crossing that allowed vehicles to move over the railway and into the training area. The overpass shown in this image did not yet exist, so instead imagine the crossing was level, meaning vehicles had to physically drive on the tracks. From what I have gathered, it was procedure for personnel to carry lanterns at night in 300 metre intervals up and down the track either side of the crossing point to alert oncoming traffic. According to sources though, this order was often ignored or grossly violated, as was the case this evening. At this point, just before the embankment, the instructor would have ordered the driver to shift into first gear and turn right onto the access track running parallel to the railway. However, critically, the Uzbek spoke little Russian and the intercom was reportedly very dodgy, leading to the driver mistakenly engaging second gear and continuing on straight ahead. There were no barriers between the perimeter of the access track and the railway corridor except for some minor vegetation. Viewing through the TVN-2B night vision periscope, it would have been very difficult to determine where the track ended and the railway began. This is a recreation of what that may have looked like. Unaware of the impending danger, the driver continued on straight ahead, either ignoring or misunderstanding the repeated commands by the Russian to turn right at the access track. The instructor quickly realised that the vehicle was about to enter the rail embankment. Desperate and lacking any control authority himself, he resorted to the only action he could take: the emergency stop engine cut-off switch installed in the turret of the T-64. Whilst cutting fuel to the engine, the emergency stop does not engage any braking, and the tank coasted under its own momentum before stalling across the northbound main line immobilised. The instructor knew immediately the danger they were in. Can you imagine the dread when they could hear and feel the approaching train? With no way to restart the stricken tank quickly, both the instructor and the driver evacuated the tank and got clear. Meanwhile, the D716 Express came up the tracks at full pelt, around its max speed of 110 to 120 km per hour. At that velocity, the engineers would have needed a minimum of 580 metres of emergency braking to stop, but in the dark the train crew never saw the T-64 until it was too late. At approximately 1750, an unstoppable force met an unmovable object, and well, the collision was catastrophic. The 006 locomotive flipped on its side. The tank was mangled and pushed down the trackway 130 metres. Several passenger coaches derailed, crumpled or strewn across the embankment. It was carnage. Tragically, the 2 East German locomotive engineers were killed instantly, and 4 passengers in the lead carriages also lost their lives. 33 others on board suffered injuries ranging from minor to severe. Given the crash proximity to Forst Zinna, many were immediately alerted to the disaster. Soviet personnel rushed to the scene to try and help the survivors. They brought first aid, equipment and floodlights and pulled people from the wreckage. When some passengers discovered a Soviet tank had caused the crash, however, they became hostile, throwing ballast stones at the Soviets trying to help. Within 90 minutes, East German Volkspolizei investigators from nearby Jüterbog descended on the site. This was a notable deviation from standard practice, as prior incidents involving Soviet military personnel in East Germany were typically managed exclusively by Soviet authorities. A special 8-man forensics commission from Potsdam arrived the same night to begin examining the wreckage. In another unprecedented move, the East German police arrested the 2 tank crew members and took them in for questioning, a sign of the straining relationship between Moscow and the DDR at the time. The official report placed full blame on the Soviet tank crew and the training deficiencies, concluding that the tank's intrusion caused the crash and that the train crew's actions were not at fault. The language difficulties between the Uzbek trainee and his Russian instructor were explicitly cited as the root cause of the navigation mistake. East German officials also noted with frustration that the Soviet military's exercise protocols had allowed a novice driver to operate a tank near an active railway at night, calling this a grave safety oversight. As I alluded to, in the decades leading up to the disaster, it was routine for incidents involving Soviet military units to be downplayed or covered up by the East German authorities. It was extremely unlikely for the regime to publicise events that may embarrass their Soviet brethren. In particular, there had been other rail disasters even occurring on the exact same rail line that were hushed up, and you can barely find any resources surviving to this day. A good example is the 1962 Trebin rail disaster, where a Soviet T-55 tank being transported on a flat rail car had its turret come loose and its barrel swung into the adjacent rail corridor, where it sliced through an oncoming express train. Over 100 people are thought to have been killed by this incident alone, yet there is basically no information online or in print about this topic to this day. Other rail-related incidents in the area were put down to track warping or other vague causes rather than implicate the Soviets. Contrast that to the 1988 Forst Zinna disaster, and things couldn't be any different. The crash was handled with unprecedented transparency in the DDR. Widely reported in the media, they candidly outlined Soviet involvement as being directly responsible. Even Western correspondents were able to provide coverage on the disaster based on smuggled crash site footage from East German sources.
Ein sowjetischer Panzer hat gestern Abend in der DDR ein schweres Zugunglück verursacht. 6 Menschen kamen dabei ums Leben, 35 wurden verletzt, einige von ihnen schwer. Das Unglück ereignete sich auf der Strecke Leipzig-Stralsund in der Nähe der Ortschaft Forst Zinna.
Many historians and theorists have pointed out the timing of this coverage was no coincidence in the DDR. The relationship between Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev and East German leader Erich Honecker were on very rocky territory. Honecker, a die-hard socialist and party lineman, had been growing frustrated with Gorbachev's increasingly westernised views, and perestroika, or restructuring. East Germany seized the opportunity to publicly embarrass the Soviets over the blunder in a propaganda piece that would go on to stun and enrage Moscow. The fate of the 2 Soviet crewmen remains unclear to this day, although there are rumours. Upon questioning, there was no doubt as to the cause of the disaster: miscommunication and a language barrier. However, diplomatic agreements with the Soviets meant that they were not permitted to prosecute them under East German law. Within days, the 2 were back in Soviet hands and would face judgment by a military tribunal, with them ultimately being whisked out of East Germany. It was awkward for the DDR. They had blamed the men publicly, yet couldn't deliver any firm news of justice being carried out for those who were affected by the crash. This wouldn't have helped the growing resentment and mistrust between East German nationals and the USSR. There aren't many accounts of what happened next, as their fate was never publicly disclosed. Some believe they faced the death penalty. However, I don't believe this was the case based on accounts from people who were in their unit. There are also suggestions that both men were ultimately acquitted of any wrongdoing. In the wake of the tragedy, safety was improved around the Forst Zinna training complex. The East German authorities, in cooperation with the Soviet army, installed robust measures along the railway boundary. A proper concrete overpass was constructed that enabled free movement of tanks across to the northern training area. Whilst it has since been demolished, you can still see the abutments of this crossing today. Dragon's teeth, earthen ditches and other protective measures would go a long way to ensure a similar accident could never occur again, and indeed no other incidents occurred with vehicles crossing into the railway. It's just a shame that such measures were reactive rather than preventative, and only the Forst Zinna tragedy finally compelled action to physically separate tanks and trains. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, upheaving the political landscape across East and West Germany. By October 1990, Germany was reunified, and just 13 short months later, in December of 1991, Gorbachev resigned. The USSR dissolved with the formal withdrawal of all Soviet troops, of whom numbered over 380,000 in Germany, occurring in parallel. The site at Forst Zinna was effectively abandoned and left to rot, serving limited to no purpose for the new government. In 2007, major demolition works to renaturalise the area commenced, which removed a majority of the storage and maintenance buildings, and the defunct train station, but much of the historic barracks blocks are preserved to this day. The wider training area is now over 7,000 hectares of nature reserve. However, a significant portion is still restricted to the public due to the danger of unexploded ordnance from decades of military use. The B101 highway was provided a modern extension in the 2010s and was constructed directly between the railway line and the former compound. Most people who travel along this stretch of highway unknowingly pass what was once the Forst Zinna training area, and without knowledge of whatever happened here in 1988. The tracks running through the former training area remain in service as part of the modern Berlin-Halle rail line, with the memory of the Kanonenbahn now a historic footnote. These days, the Forst Zinna railway disaster is remembered as a poignant anecdote, a collision symbolic of an era where military might met civilian life with tragic consequences. It serves as a reminder of the human cost of miscommunication and the delicate balance of foreign troops on local soil. Each year, around January 19th, local media and railway enthusiasts often recall the event and to remember those who lost their lives. Though there is no formal monument at the site, the story lives on in archives, documentaries, and the memories of those who were there.